Hello plant lovers, it is Matthew in Melbourne welcoming you back to my channel. Thank you very much for finding me if you're new here. I post every week about growing cold, cool, intermediate orchids here in Melbourne, Australia without greenhouses or humidifiers or grow lights. They're either inside, outside, or they're out of the pool. So if that sounds like it is your thing, do hit subscribe. I do post every week and I am, plant lovers, a complete amateur. Now, why are we in the dining room, Matthew? I hear you cry. Well, this week, plant lovers, I think we need to do a what do I pot my orchid in 101, because when I first started to grow orchids, that was a real question that I had and found quite difficult to answer. So what I thought today is we will go through all the different potting mediums that I use and go through each one and the type of orchids you might use it for, and see if that makes any sense for you if you're beginning your orchid potting journey and, as I was, a little confused as to where to start. Now, I should say at the very beginning, these are only things that I have used for potting my orchids in my environment. Now, wherever you might be, you might need different things for your orchids and you might grow them in hydro and other systems. So this is a video just for people that grow their orchids either in pots or in baskets using medium. I hope it will be useful because it did take me quite a while to figure out just what to use. So we're going to travel through all the different potting mediums that you can use or mix together, and then the different things that you might want to put in that mix depending on the orchid that you're growing. So without further ado, let us begin. All right, let us remove our bags of sphagnum moss and perhaps start at the beginning. Okay, so here's something I prepared earlier. Let's start at the very beginning, shall we? With, if you go to a garden centre, what are you going to see? You're going to see bags of potting mix. Now, would you ever use this for potting orchids? And this is what it is like. It is obviously just the usual potting mix that you are going to use for any potted plant that you would need to repot, pot on seedlings, etc., etc. So regular store-bought potting mix does actually sometimes have a part to play in growing orchids. And so the orchids that I use, regular potting mix, are terrestrials. So this one is what's known as a jewel orchid. This is Ludicea discolor. If you can see that, I'll put the name below. Very, very beautiful leaves. I'll come and do a close-up for you. Now, this type of plant is what we might call a proper terrestrial in that it actually lives in the soil and has its roots in the soil and runs across the leaf litter in the understory. So if you were growing something like this, a classic terrestrial plant that actually grows in soil, then I would use potting mix. Now, you might want to loosen it up a little bit if you feel this is just a little too chunky, and you could loosen it up with bark or the next product that we're going to look at. But the other thing that I use regular potting mix for is Bletilla striata. Now, I know this is a very unglamorous plastic bag, but I was actually just given some tubers of Bletilla, as you can see. There we go, which I'm actually going to pot after this video. Now, here in Melbourne, this orchid I will actually be planting in the garden, so directly into the soil. So you certainly can use regular potting mix for these if you're growing them in the pot. Again, if you feel that that potting mix is just a little too chunky and you want to lighten it up, you can with other products, which we will get to in a minute. And the other orchid that I use regular potting mix with is Zygopetalum. But in fact, what I do with Zygos is mix this with a bark-based orchid mix. So it's probably 50% potting mix, 50% orchid-specific bark mix, and we'll get to that. And in case you're wondering, this is my Zygo Rescue Zygo, which I made a video about, which I'll link below. As you can see, all the new growth's very healthy. I am really, really hoping I get spikes this season anyway. So that's in a mix of potting mix and a orchid bark mix. Okay, so there is a place in your repertoire for regular potting mix. And plant lovers, there is also a place in your repertoire for out of the bag orchid mix. This stuff is a mixed bag. So when I first began growing orchids, I went to the garden centre and I saw the word orchid mix and thought, aha, that is for orchids. And so I used it for everything. Now, the thing is that it's actually quite hard to kill a lot of orchids quickly, and often the potting medium isn't necessarily going to be the thing that kills it quickly. You're much more likely to kill it through overwatering. So I don't really think you can make a huge mistake, depending on the type of orchid it is. Obviously, there are huge caveats over that. But like me, if you begin using out of the bag orchid mix, I don't think the world is going to end. And for some things, this is really suitable. You would know that a lot of orchids are grown in bark, and this out of the bag mix, and I don't know about other regions, but in Australia this is fairly consistent. I don't know what it would be like perhaps in Europe or the States with these kind of pre-mixed mixes, but here you certainly do get the bark, but you also get coconut fibre, and you also get what I'm basically going to call gritty potting mix almost. So it's got a consistency that is loose, but it is still quite grainy. Now for some things, this is perfect. I would say it's kind of halfway between a terrestrial and an epiphytic mix generally. So some things this works really well for. And as I said, I grew everything in this when I first started growing orchids. So Oncidiums, Miltoniopsis, Miltonias, and Cymbidiums. They're all still alive. Most of them have been repotted, but this I still use for some things, and I will now show you what. All right, out of the bag orchid mix, which is not the devil's work, I use for the following. Cymbidiums. I guess the other thing to maybe talk about is the difference between terrestrial and terrestrial. So a lot of orchids that are described as terrestrial actually live on the top of the soil, but at ground level. So they might live in the understory, but they will live perhaps in the nooks of roots, or on mossy mounds, or on mounds of leaf litter, etc. So they're not really sending their roots into the soil as such, they just happen to grow on the soil surface in other medium. So that can be a little confusing, whereas there are also terrestrial orchids that are like regular perennial plants that have a tuber or a bulb or a rhizome in the soil and send their roots down and grow like a normal plant. So those are the things that we use regular potting mix for. That would also include bog orchids, so things like Phalaenopsis, for example, and swamp orchids. They will need a regular soil mix that is going to stay damp all the time. But Cymbidiums are a bit opportunistic, so they will be terrestrial and epiphytic as well. They'll grow in those kind of in nooks of trees or in nooks of roots at the ground level, so all over the place really. They're a very tough and adaptive species. And of course, there are many species growing in lots of different environments, including Australia, which I didn't know, but there is a couple of Cymbidiums native to here. So with all my Cymbidiums, I use out of the bag orchid mix with nothing else. So I don't add bark or sphagnum moss or anything else. I just use it out of the bag and pot the orchids straight away, and they all do really well and are blooming. And in fact, this is a seedling that I bought maybe last year, and it is Cymbidium erythrostylum, I think is how you pronounce it. It's a native to, I think, Vietnam off the top of my head, and it's actually got flower spikes. It's an awesome flower, and it's awesome in Australia right now. And I am so excited. I'll come in and show you closely, but it's got spikes. So I use out of the bag orchid mix for all my Cymbidiums. And the other thing that I use store-bought orchid mix for are all of my Australian orchids. So Sarcochilus, like this one. This is, it's actually called Red. This one I made a video about when it was in bloom, beautiful red flowers. So all the Australian Sarcochilus and all the Australian native Dendrobiums, the Kingianum and Speciosum that I have, all get potted in, out of the bag potting mix, and they bloom and they are as happy as Larry. And the other thing I use out of the bag orchid mix for is all my Masdevallia. And this one, plant lovers, I've noticed has got a flower. And this one is Masdevallia floribunda. And I actually got this as a tiny little seedling 6 to 8 months ago in one of those little plastic slips that you get from hardware stores for $8.95. And I'd never seen it for sale before. Happy as Larry, and it's blooming for me. So when this flowers, I'll actually do a video about it. And coming back to Zygo Rescue, in this potting mix, I actually used half of this out of the bag orchid mix and half of the regular potting mix that I showed you before. So this is 50-50 of this and this. Now, just in case you're going to ask, this picture behind me is one of a series of 4, and it's my partner's father. And for his 80th birthday, my partner organised a photographer and a makeup artist, and there are 4 images of him all in kiss makeup. And they are amazing. We're in a rental house at the moment. We only have room to hang one. And this is a 17th century piece of a probably cut down of a larger painting of a Spanish painting. And there is Op Shop Jesus. He came from a thrift store here in Melbourne. Okay, so there we go. We've done the first two. Now the next most common thing that you will hear of and seen referred to is bark. And guess what? It is exactly what it sounds like. It is essentially bark, and it's often pine bark, and who knows what else it might be, but in Australia it's often pine bark. And it is perhaps the most common medium for potting epiphytic orchids. The reason being is that, as you can see, when it's together, there are lots of spaces between each bit. So there's lots of air movement and water passes through it really quickly, so it drains really quickly. There are plenty of room for roots to penetrate the spaces in between, and the bark is reasonably absorbent, so it is going to absorb water, but it's not going to stay soggy and wringing wet as a regular potting mix might. So this is why bark is one of the easiest and most popular and most successful things used to pot orchids in. So with bark, you can get big bark, and you can get small bark, and you can get medium bark. It's very Goldilocks, isn't it? So what is the difference between the three, and where and why would you use them? So large bark is perhaps the bark type that is going to drain the fastest, because obviously it's biggest and the gaps between each piece are the largest. So it's physics, the water is going to go whoosh through quite quickly. So if you imagine an epiphytic orchid living up in a tree, when it rains, the water passes through really quickly. The orchid uptakes as much as it can, and maybe a little bit of the organic matter that's around the root system will absorb some water too, and then it drains away, and the whole thing will slowly drain and dry until the next rain. There's also, of course, humidity and perhaps mist as well that the orchid can draw moisture from. So this is often the best way to sort of replicate that natural environment in pot culture. And you would use these large bark pieces in orchids that have quite thick, quite strong roots, and particularly orchids that want to drain really quickly. So you would drench the pot, the water would run out the bottom, you would wait till it's finished dripping out the bottom, put your orchid back in its saucer, and then depending on the orchid, if it needs to really dry out, you would leave it for however many days you would, and then repeat. So this is a great material for orchids that need to dry really well between waterings and that are quite chunky. So I use large bark pieces generally for all of my nobile type soft cane dendrobiums, because often they want to dry out really quickly, and they also have a dormancy period where they want to be kept relatively dry. The other thing I use large bark pieces for is larger bulbophyllum, and I mix it with other things, which we will get to, but I feel that these plants want to drain reasonably quickly, but they also need to retain moisture. So with that large bark, there's actually a lot of sphagnum moss in this, but depends on the type of bulbophyllum, obviously. The ones which are smaller with much finer roots, I will use smaller bark. And this one is Elizabeth Ann Buckleberry, which, as you can see, is in bloom. And so on our bark journey, medium bark is basically what I use for just about everything, and I mix it with other things, and we'll get to those other things in a minute. But I use medium bark for Miltoniopsis, and you can see, very happy is this, which is Kelly Spangled Banner. She's very famous. I've made too many videos about her, but you can see there's actually 1, 2, 3, 4 spikes plus the one that's out. It's doing very well. And Nellie Isla is in a mix of that medium-sized bark with other things, which we'll get to as well. And as you can see, she is doing very well. And Oncidiums. Now this is Oncidium sotuanum, which is a species type which is in spike at the moment. As you can see, this has the most beautiful blooms, and I've made a video about this, which I will also link. So yes, Oncidiums and all the Oncidium alliances, so the Wilsonara, Miltassia, etc, 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 all of those sort of Oncidium alliances, I would use the medium bark with a few other things which we'll get to. And then last cab off the bark rank is the very, very small pieces, which kind of look like choc chips. Now I would use that on smaller orchids that have much finer roots and don't perhaps have the vigor to push their way through heavier, larger pieces of bark. And that really depends on the orchid. You know, some orchids have really fine roots and some have really thick, fleshy roots. So it's just a question of seeing what the root system is like and the size of the plant. and also how it likes to be watered, whether it likes to dry out quite quickly or whether it doesn't. So the drier it likes to be, I think the larger the bark, and the more moist it likes to be, the smaller the bark. And that is just the basis of the mix that you create. So that's a bit of a general rule of thumb for me. Okay, working our way through now, we've gone from bagged regular potting mix, we've gone from pre-mixed bagged orchid mix, we've gone to the different types of barks you can find. And those barks, by the way, generally are sold in Australia, they're sold by millimetre diameter. So you just have to kind of figure out which is the small, medium and large one. Good idea to get a lot of the medium, a little bit of the little, and a little bit of the big. It depends on the sort of orchids you're growing though. And you can obviously mix all of them together in different quantities if you just want to play around with what might be going on with your orchid. So again, you're really not going to kill an orchid by potting it in bark that's too big or too small. It might struggle and show you that it's struggling, but you're probably not going to kill it. So I think we can all just relax a little bit too about quite what we are using. All right, so the last sort of major material I use is pumice stone. I know, weird, but it is obviously, it's a rock, and it's kind of got very dippled surfaces. So obviously the rock itself isn't porous, but the surface is covered with little sort of micro indentations. So it does actually retain quite a lot of moisture. And it is a great material for keeping other materials loose and open. So for example, if you wanted to open up your bark mix a bit more, you could use pumice for something that might be described as a lithophyte, because they grow in rocky crevices. And I also use pumice for Vandas. Ta-da! So this is a Vanda I'm experimenting with to see if I can grow it in Melbourne, which is really not the best conditions for Vandas because we're not warm and humid enough in winter. And so what I'm doing with this is growing it outside in summer and then inside in winter in a very sunny, bright spot. But Vandas, as you know, in their ideal circumstance, would just be hanging in a basket with no medium at all. But I am not in such a humid environment, so I need to give it something else to hang on to, basically. So with this one, what I did was I used pumice stones and I tried to find the biggest pieces I could, and I mixed it with chopped sphagnum moss and a little bit, but literally not much, of the largest pieces of bark. So it's very, very loose, quite large pieces. The only thing that kind of knits it together is the sphagnum moss, and that's really to maintain the moisture. And there we go. This plant's probably doubled in size. It was a tiny seedling from one of those little plastic tubes from a hardware store for $8.95. So I thought, look, nothing ventured, nothing gained for $9. And it is doing really well, keeps producing new leaves, and it's growing well, it's producing new roots. So it seems to be happy in its pumice stone mix. And so I've used that as a bit of a basis for all the Vandaceous types of orchids that I'm trying to grow. And in fact, one of them has a flower spike, and I'm not going to talk about that because it's about to bloom and I'll make a video about it. But anything that's really Vanda-like that comes from much more warm or hot conditions that I can give, I use that pumice as a basis for its mix. And now, ladies and gentlemen, getting to the end of our major potting material cycle, we are going to talk about sphagnum moss. So yes, sphagnum moss, as we all know probably, is moss. It is a natural material, and the thing about sphagnum moss is obviously it is very moisture retentive. And it is a great material for potting orchids in. Now, depending on your climate and where you are, it might be the only material that you use to pot your orchids in, or like me, it might just be a major component of the mix that you create. The only two things that I grow 100% in sphagnum are some of my Phalaenopsis. Now here's, look at this poor sorry flower. It's the last flower on this spike. This is the orchid that was the star of my do I chop or do I not chop experiment. So this was the original flower spike that bloomed, and then it immediately produced another growth point, and I thought, oh, I'm going to leave that and see what happens. It was just about to open when one of the cleaners snapped it off, and then it immediately resprouted from that snap point, and the flowering is just about to finish. So I'm going to leave this because it's such a green, thick, healthy spike. Anyway, I digress. As you can see, 100% sphagnum moss. Now, this is growing in a vessel, obviously without any drainage, which you might say is crazy, Matthew. Yes, I would agree, but my excuse is that I started to pot my Phalaenopsis in glass vessels because that's how I'd seen them in shops and in other people's houses before I really knew much about them. Obviously, watering is key because you don't want them to get really soggy because there's nowhere for it to drain. But with glass, ironically enough, you can see exactly where your water level is. So for me, my Phalaenopsis seem to do really well in pure sphagnum moss. The thing about sphagnum moss is to just keep your eye on it to make sure that it's not starting to decompose, because then it gets quite acidic and the orchid's not going to like that. You can see how healthy it is, particularly if you've got it in a glass vessel. But if you're repotting your orchids sort of every couple of years, then that's going to be fine. So I use sphagnum moss for Phalaenopsis and seedlings. So when a seedling comes out of the flask, the roots are often really quite fine and they are not going to have the wherewithal to push through heavy medium. So if you imagine in the wild, the seed is probably going to settle on the top of moss in the wild, or a little bit of leaf mold or something like that. The optimum space, or a little crevice in the bark, which is a bit mossy. So imagine that. The fine roots kind of need a gentle breaking into the world of proper root growth. So sphagnum moss for seedlings is a goer for me. Now this one, I actually bought this seedling in a plastic tube from a hardware store because someone had asked me a question about making a film about potting seedlings and how to deal with them. So I bought this and it was a very sad little plant. But as you can see, it's actually starting to shoot again. And it's a dendrobium, and it's Dendrobium odoratum, which is, I think, a species with white flowers and beautiful fragrance, strange enough, because it's called odoratum. So I'm just nurturing this on a little bit until it's a little bit bigger. I made a deflasking video, which I'll also link below, and I used sphagnum moss to pot all of those on. So those are the two instances where I use sphagnum moss as the only medium. But then generally, sphagnum moss is part of my regular mix, which kind of then gets to the whole mixing together of all of these ingredients. So a basic orchid mix for me would be bark, sphagnum moss, and a few additional extras. So let's look at those. Charcoal. Ta-da! So charcoal you can buy, and it's usually called horticultural charcoal or propagating charcoal. And you can buy that anywhere from any hardware store or garden centre or nursery. And that is a great material. So it's not something that I use 100% to pot something in. It is a component of the mix I make using bark and sphagnum moss. So bark would make up the majority of the mix, and then sphagnum moss the majority of the remainder. And then I would use a handful of charcoal. And charcoal, again, just acts as a loosener, and it's an organic material, so it can absorb water. It's very hygienic. It's got amazing sort of antibacterial qualities. It's great, but it loosens up the mix. So it helps airflow through the soil, and it also helps with fast drainage of water. So charcoal is great. It's also very light, so it keeps the pot light, but it's also great for roots because they can grow into it and it's quite natural. Okay, the other thing I would mix with bark to make a sort of a basic orchid mix is perlite. Again, perlite is a natural material, although it does kind of look a little bit like polystyrene, which always bothered me because I am vehemently opposed to polystyrene. But no, it's not. It's actually a volcanic rock that's been treated at high temperatures. So it's yeah, an amazing material, but it's very absorbent. Like sphagnum moss, perlite enables water retention in your bark mix. So it just holds on to the water a little bit longer than the bark necessarily might do, like the sphagnum moss will. It also just helps aerate the mixture that you're using. The thing is about epiphytic orchids is, of course, they want lots of airflow because they're usually clinging to a tree branch or a nook of a tree somewhere. So there's lots of air movement and lots of moisture around them. So they don't want to be confined in a really stodgy material in an airtight pot. So you want to try and keep it as light as possible. And perlite is one of those materials, and it's incredibly light and airy. So those are really the basic ingredients for your basic mix: bark, charcoal, perlite, sphagnum moss in any combination that you desire. Then the other odd things that I use, shell grit. I picked up this tip from the wonderful Rachel at Gardening in Duensa, whose orchid videos I watch avidly. And shell grit is full of calcium. And it's also obviously quite loose, so it just helps in that whole aeration thing, but you don't put much in it. You literally just put a sprinkle across the top. But it is full of calcium. So this is more of a seasoning. It's like sprinkling pepper on food. And what helps with the calcium in your shell grit is mycorrhizal fungi. Now this packet is so faded and dirty. You can't read the brand, but this is Mycorrhizal fungi powder, and I put a little bit of that in every orchid that I pot. And the mycorrhizal fungi has a symbiotic relationship with the plant's roots and itself, and it helps extract nutrients from the soil and make it available to the plant. So it promotes healthy root growth and a healthy plant. So the mycorrhizal fungi help extract the calcium from these shell grits. The other thing I put into my mix is always a little bit of a slow release fertilizer. So literally those kind of pellets. And I literally would just put 1 or 2 into the mix when I repot the plant, and then usually once a year in spring, but it depends on the orchid. Sometimes you might do that twice a year, depends on its growth season and flowering cycle. So the other thing that I sometimes use is coconut fibre, and this is, as you can see, quite literally fibrous, and you can use this to line hanging baskets, but I have used this with these sorts of containers. Now, because I am A, in a climate that has cold winters, B, in a rental house, I can't really grow things in baskets such as this because there aren't that many orchids that could stay outside all year in my conditions that can thrive in these sorts of receptacles. Anyway, there are a few dendrobiums and some other types of orchids that I can keep outside all year. So aren't these amazing? It's just a piece of hardwood in this basket. Fantastic for dendrobiums, smaller dendrobiums and other such things. And obviously this is like a classic Vanda basket. And so quite big gaps, as you can see. And what I use is this coconut fibre to simply line it as you would a regular hanging basket. And then inside that, I would use my regular mix, depending on the orchid, which would be your bark-based mix. And the coconut fibre just stops all the bits falling out. And the other weird thing I've had to use lately is clay. Can you believe it? If we go right back to the beginning with our out of the bag regular potting mix, mixed with clay, you might think is insane, Matthew. Well, I recently bought an Australian terrestrial orchid that's native to South Australia, and it grows in very clayey soil, and the grower recommended mixing some clay with regular potting mix to plant it. So where does one get clay? By the side of the road, plant lovers. I have another YouTube channel with Stephen Ryan, who's a wonderful horticulturalist, and his garden, which is amazing, is actually very clayey soil, which he has spent years improving. But by the side of the road, there are just mounds of clay. So last time I was up there, I got myself a bag full of clay to mix with regular potting mix to plant that terrestrial orchid. Now, it's a summer dormant plant. It's going to start growing in autumn and hopefully flowering in winter. So if it does, I will make a video about it, because anything that can grow in a clay mix, we need to know about. There we are, plant lovers. That is my what do I grow my orchids in 101. And I only made this video because it literally did take me years to figure all this out. And I am no genius, and all of this information is out there, but it's often just quite hard to find what you need. And you know, I was not really that confident and didn't really know much, and was a bit embarrassed really to say, well, what have you put your orchid in? So I started unashamedly with out of the bag orchid mix, and then I've basically learned more and more and more about the orchids I grow and what their ideal potting requirements are, and really gone from there. So I hope this has been useful. I think the moral of the story is don't worry too much. If you're using an out of the bag orchid mix, you're probably going to be okay. Most things are going to be fine. Some things might not thrive, but they're going to be okay. And the more you learn about it, the more you'll realize. And then when you come to repot it, you'll perhaps make a different choice and the orchid might be happier. And all of the things that I've showed you that I pot in specific ways, that's just the way that I'm doing it. And for you in your environment or your climate or your type of pots, might be completely different. So Phalaenopsis, for example, there are a million ways to pot those. So don't think the only way to do it is with sphagnum moss, really depends. And I also pot Phalaenopsis in other medium mixes as well. So this is not the gospel, according to Matthew, about how to pot your orchids. It's quite simply what I've learned has worked for me and for the orchids that I grow. So I hope it has been of use to you. Thank you for joining me in the dining room with my father-in-law who is watching over us all, and I look forward very much to seeing you next week. Hit subscribe if you want to know what that adventure might be, and I will see you then.